Little girl hid behind him whispering, "He found us again." The Hell's Angel's eyes went cold. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seems to be wrapped in a peaceful stillness. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the air was crisp with the coolness of early winter. The road stretched ahead, empty and desolate, but to anyone paying attention, there was something unsettling about the stillness. As the roar of a motorcycle engine cut through the silence, the unmistakable rumble of a Harley-Davidson filled the air. It was a sound that could make even the most hardened individuals pause. Jake Reaper Morrison, a Hell's Angel with a reputation that preceded him, was riding through the back roads. His thoughts were far from the road ahead, as he was trying to shake off the weight of his past. But as he rounded a corner, something caught his attention. A faint voice. It was soft, barely audible over the engine's roar, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. "He found us again." The voice sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't the voice of an adult, but of a child. His instincts kicked in. His heart raced as he slowed the bike and scanned the area. There, tucked behind a dilapidated shack, he saw her. A little girl, no more than 10, her wide eyes filled with terror as she peered around the corner. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't a man to be easily rattled, but there was something about her fear that felt real, something that went beyond the normal dangers of the world he lived in. Without hesitation, Jake pulled his bike to a stop. He dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a firm thud. The little girl flinched as he approached, her small body trembling in the shadows. Hey, it's okay." Jake's voice softened, the tough exterior he carried for years beginning to crack. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl looked up at him with a mixture of suspicion and fear. "He's coming. He's going to hurt us." Her voice was shaky, barely a whisper, but it was enough to pierce through the hardened shell Jake had built around himself. Jake's mind raced. He had seen the worst of humanity, but something about this innocent little girl, hiding behind him, made his blood run cold. "Who's coming?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. "He found us again," the girl repeated, her words laced with dread. "The man, he's coming for us." Jake's gut twisted. This wasn't just a random encounter. The girl had been hiding from someone, and whoever he was, he had put fear into her like nothing Jake had ever seen. He needed answers. The girl, noticing Jake's concern, took a step forward, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't know who he is, but he's always there. He finds us, no matter where we go." Her eyes filled with tears. Jake's heart ached for her. It wasn't just the words she said, but the fear in her eyes that unsettled him. He knew this wasn't just a simple case of a lost child. She was running from something, or someone, far worse. Without thinking, Jake reached out and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry, I'm not going to let him get to you." His words were meant to comfort her, but even he wasn't sure if he could keep that promise. The girl looked up at him, her eyes full of hope and fear. "Thank you," she whispered, and in that moment, Jake knew he couldn't walk away. He would protect her, no matter what it took. As he scanned the surroundings once more, he felt the weight of his decision settle on him. He had been alone for so long, but now, he had someone to protect. And whoever this man was, he was going to make sure he never got anywhere near her. As Jake stood in the shadows of the abandoned shack, his eyes scanned the desolate street. The little girl, still clutching the hem of his jacket, was shaking. He could feel her fear radiating through her, and it made his chest tighten. The sun had long set, and the chill of the night air was starting to creep in, but the sense of urgency, the weight of the situation, made everything seem colder. Jake wasn't sure what he was getting into, but he knew one thing. He wasn't leaving without that little girl. He crouched down to her level, trying to offer comfort. "We'll be okay, kid. Just stick with me." The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, but there was a flicker of hope in them now. She was trusting him, and that was all Jake needed to keep moving forward. "Where is he? The man you're running from?" Jake asked, keeping his voice low, calm, hoping to make her feel safe. The girl took a shaky breath, her voice trembling. He's always following us. He's been after us for a long time. I don't know how he keeps finding us. Jake's stomach churned. He could hear the terror in her voice, and it made his blood boil. No one, especially a little girl, should be running from something like that. Who is he? Do you know what he wants? The girl hesitated, then whispered, I don't know his name, but he's always there. He finds us, no matter where we go. Jake stood up, his hands clenched into fists. Whoever this man was, he wasn't going to get away with this. He turned and scanned the empty street again, but there was no sign of movement. It felt like they were alone, but Jake knew better than to trust the silence. All right, Jake said, his voice firm now. We're not staying here. We need to get you somewhere safe. He didn't know where he was going yet, but he knew he had to get the girl away from here. He motioned for her to follow as he walked toward his bike. The girl hesitated for a moment, but then followed, her small feet barely making a sound against the cracked pavement. As they walked, Jake's mind raced. He had a million questions, but for now, the most important thing was getting her to safety. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, that danger was closing in, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. They reached his bike, and Jake helped the girl onto the back, making sure she was secure, before swinging onto the seat in front of her. As the engine roared to life, Jake couldn't help but glance over his shoulder once more. Nothing. No movement. But the unease still gnawed at him. He started the ride slowly at first, weaving through the empty streets. His mind was racing. He had to get her somewhere safe, but where? There was only one place he could think of, a secluded cabin in the woods where he used to go to clear his head. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for now. They couldn't go to the police. That would be too dangerous. Jake didn't trust the authorities, and if this man had been following the girl for as long as she said, there was a good chance he had some kind of influence. Hold on tight, kid. Jake called over his shoulder, trying to keep his voice light, though his stomach was tied in knots. As they sped down the road, the wind whipping through their hair, Jake's mind kept flashing to the girl's words. She'd said this man had been after her for a long time. How long? What had he done to her? Was he part of something bigger? Jake didn't know, but he wasn't going to wait around to find out. They rode for miles, the trees around them growing thicker as they left the town behind. The world felt like it was getting smaller, more isolated, but at least for now, it felt safer. Jake took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs, trying to calm his nerves. As they neared the cabin, Jake could see the faint light of the moon reflecting off the windows. He slowed down, then parked in front of the small structure. It was a simple place, but it had always been his sanctuary. He helped the girl off the bike, leading her inside. The cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke, a comforting scent that made Jake's shoulders relax for the first time all day. He locked the door behind them, then turned to the girl. She was standing by the window, her back to him, staring out into the darkness. You're safe now, Jake said, his voice softer than usual. She nodded, but her eyes were distant, lost in thought. Thank you, she whispered. You don't have to thank me, Jake said, his voice a little rough. But we're not out of the woods yet. We need to stay alert. The girl turned to him, her expression filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. What if he comes here? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's eyes hardened. He won't get past me. I'll protect you, no matter what it takes. He meant it. The darkness outside might have been creeping closer, but for the first time in a long time, Jake knew he had something worth fighting for. I don't know how long they stayed in the cabin before Jake started feeling the weight of the silence. It had been hours since they arrived, and the only sounds that broke the stillness were the wind outside and the occasional creak of the old wood beneath their feet. Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the forest around them. He'd been on edge all night, listening for the slightest sign of movement, but so far, it had been eerily quiet. The girl, whose name was Emily, had fallen asleep on the couch. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale but peaceful now that she was away from the fear that had haunted her for so long. Jake couldn't help but look at her every now and then, wondering what kind of life she had led before all of this. How had she ended up in such a nightmare? What kind of person would put a child in that position? He clenched his jaw. Whoever it was, he wasn't going to let them near her again. He heard a sound behind him, and turned to see Emily standing in the doorway. She was looking at him, her eyes filled with something between gratitude and sadness. Are you okay? She asked quietly. Jake wasn't sure if she was asking about him or herself, but he nodded. I'm fine. He gestured for her to sit down. You should rest. You've been through a lot. Emily hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down on the couch. She wrapped her arms around her knees, staring at the fire that had been crackling softly in the stone hearth. Jake sat down across from her, trying to give her space. He wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability. He had spent years building walls around himself, shutting out the world. Now with this little girl looking at him like she was waiting for him to do something, he wasn't sure what to say. I didn't think I'd ever be safe again, Emily said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought he'd always find me. I didn't know what to do. Jake's heart ached for her. He had heard enough in her voice to know that she had been running for a long time. You don't have to worry anymore, he said, his voice steady. You're safe here. As long as I'm around, he won't get to you. Emily didn't respond at first. She just stared into the fire, lost in her own thoughts. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, but also something else, a kind of weariness, like she had given up on ever finding peace. He couldn't blame her. No child should have to live like that. Who is he? Jake asked after a moment. The man you're running from. Emily's eyes flickered with fear, but she didn't speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was tight, strained. I don't know his name. He's always there, though, like a shadow. He's been following me and my mom for as long as I can remember. Every time we think we're safe, he shows up again. It's like he knows where we are, no matter how far we go. Jake's brow furrowed. This wasn't just some random person. Whoever this man was, he had resources. He had a way of tracking people. What did he do to you? Jake asked, though he already had a feeling he didn't want to hear the answer. Emily hesitated, her small hands tightening around her knees. She trailed off, biting her lip. He hurt my mom. He took her away from me. I haven't seen her in months. Jake's fist clenched, his heart racing. Whoever this guy was, he was sick. No one should ever do something like that to a child, especially not a little girl like Emily. He stood up abruptly, his muscles tense with the fury building inside him. He had no idea who this man was, but he was going to find him, and he was going to make sure he never hurt anyone again. I'm going to find him, Jake said, his voice low, steady. Emily's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She trusted him, and that trust was enough to push Jake forward. He was no longer just trying to keep her safe. Now, it was personal. The man who had been stalking Emily and her mother had hurt someone Jake cared about, and he wasn't going to let him get away with it. The world outside the cabin seemed to grow darker as the night stretched on, but Jake's resolve only strengthened. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but he would track this man down. And when he did, there would be nowhere left for him to hide. I don't know how long the silence between them stretched, but it felt like an eternity. Emily sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the fire as if trying to burn away the fear that still clung to her. Jake paced by the window, his eyes darting back and forth across the dense woods outside. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't as alone as they seemed. The world around him was quiet, but in that quiet, there was a tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The weight of his promise to protect Emily pressed heavily on him. He was used to being the one who instilled fear, the one who controlled the situation. But this was different. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for someone else's safety, and the stakes had never been higher. After what felt like an eternity, Jake turned away from the window and approached Emily. She hadn't moved since he'd last spoken to her, but there was a flicker of something new in her eyes now, a mixture of trust and fear. It was as if she was beginning to understand the weight of what he had promised and the cost of his protection. He sat down beside her, his leather jacket creaking as he did. Hey, he said softly, trying to break the silence. You okay? Emily nodded without saying a word. The bruise on her cheek was still visible, though the swelling had gone down. Her hair was messy, and her clothes were rumpled, but she looked stronger now than she had when they first arrived. She had fought through so much, and yet, Jake could see the weight of the fear still. In her. I'll find him, Jake said, his voice firm. Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide. You really think you can? She asked, her voice shaky. Jake's jaw tightened. I know I can. He had no idea how he was going to find the man who had terrorized Emily and her mother, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to stop until he did. We're going to get through this, Emily, he continued. I promise you that. Emily looked at him, a small spark of hope flickering in her eyes. I believe you, she whispered. Jake stood up, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. He looked out the window once more, his mind racing with possibilities. He couldn't just sit here and wait. He had to take action. He needed to track this man down, but he wasn't sure where to start. He couldn't risk going to the police, not with the way this man had been able to track them so far. Whoever he was, he had to be dangerous, connected. Jake's mind shifted into high gear as he thought back to everything Emily had told him. She said this man had been after her and her mother for years, but there had to be something more to it. This wasn't just some random stalker. Jake had been around enough to know that people like this didn't just disappear. They had a way of getting what they wanted, and they didn't stop until they had it. Jake knew what he had to do. He needed information. He needed a lead, something he could use to track this guy down. He turned to Emily. Stay here. Lock the door behind me, he said, his voice low and steady. She didn't question him. She just nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of worry and trust. Jake grabbed his keys and stepped outside, the cold night air hitting his face like a slap. The motorcycle was parked just outside the cabin, the chrome gleaming in the moonlight. He swung his leg over it and fired up the engine, the deep growl of the Harley filling the air. The sound of the engine was a comfort to Jake. It was a sound he knew well, a sound that meant he was in control. But tonight, that control felt different. Tonight, he wasn't just riding for himself. He was riding for Emily, for the promise he had made to her. He had to find this man before it was too late. He rode down the narrow road, the bike's headlights cutting through the dark, illuminating the path ahead. His mind raced as he thought through his options. He couldn't afford to be reckless. He needed to be strategic, careful. He could start by looking into Emily's past, finding out where she and her mother had been before they ended up on the run. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Jake knew that wasn't enough. He needed to find something concrete, something that would lead him directly to the man they were running from. As he rode deeper into the night, the world around him seemed to shrink. The road was empty, the trees closing in on either side. He passed through the familiar landscape, but tonight, it all felt different. Every shadow seemed to hold a thread. Every rustle of leaves made his pulse quicken. He was getting closer. He could feel it. He wasn't just going to let this man keep hiding in the dark. Jake was going to bring him into the light, no matter what it took. I don't know how long Jake had been riding, but the world around him was becoming a blur. The headlights from his Harley cut through the darkness, the road stretching ahead, a never-ending ribbon of asphalt. His mind was on fire, thoughts racing faster than the bike could travel. He had made a promise to Emily, and he wasn't about to break it. The wind whipped against his face, biting at his skin, but it didn't matter. It was the least of his worries. The man he was hunting, the one who had been stalking Emily and her mother, was still out there, and Jake was getting closer. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces started falling into place. This wasn't just some random stalker. This was someone with resources, with connections. Someone who knew how to track people, how to manipulate situations. Jake had been in the world of the Hells Angels long enough to know when someone was dangerous. This man wasn't just dangerous. He was a ghost, hiding in the shadows, making people disappear. Jake gritted his teeth. The thought of anyone hurting a child, especially Emily, made his blood boil. He'd been through his fair share of battles, but this was different. This wasn't about survival. It was about protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. The road stretched on, and the further Jake rode, the more he felt like he was being drawn into something much larger than he had originally anticipated. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He had no idea where to look, but his instincts were telling him to head toward the old town. It was a place he hadn't been to in years, but it was where the Hells Angels had their roots, and it might be the lead he was looking for. Jake's hands gripped the handlebars tighter as he made a sharp turn onto a familiar stretch of road. The town loomed ahead, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, the buildings casting long shadows across the pavement. As he entered the town, Jake slowed the bike, scanning the area. There was something off about it, a sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air. He hadn't been back here since he left the club, and even though the place looked the same, it didn't feel the same. The streets were quieter than he remembered, almost too quiet. Jake parked the bike near the old diner, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. He killed the engine, the sudden silence making the weight of the night feel heavier. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door of the diner. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, and the smell of stale coffee and greasy food hit him immediately. The few patrons in the diner looked up as he entered, their eyes quickly darting away, recognizing him for what he was. He didn't blame them. The Hells Angels weren't exactly popular in these parts. Jake made his way to the counter, where the elderly woman behind it gave him a wary glance. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice soft but cautious. Jake leaned against the counter, his eyes scanning the room. "I'm looking for information," he said, keeping his voice low. "You know anything about a man who's been causing trouble around here? Someone who might be following a little girl and her mom." The woman's eyes narrowed, and she leaned in closer. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to say too much. He needed to find out what he could without drawing too much attention. "Just tell me what you know," he said, his tone urgent. The woman glanced around the diner again before speaking. "There's been talk. People say there's someone in town who's been asking questions about a little girl. A girl with dark hair, real quiet. They say he's been looking for her for a while." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the tension building in his chest. "Do you know who he is?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman shook her head, but she looked around nervously before continuing. "Some say he's been coming into town for months. No one knows his name, but people think he's part of something big. A lot of people have seen him asking around, but no one's willing to talk about it. They're scared." Jake cursed under his breath. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but this was worse than he imagined. Whoever this man was, he had people scared. And he wasn't just after Emily. He was after something more. "Where can I find him?" Jake asked, his voice low and intense. The woman hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before leaning in closer. "There's a warehouse on the edge of town," she whispered. "It's been closed for years, but people have seen him around there. It's a place no one goes. It's quiet, hidden. That's where you might find him." Jake nodded, his jaw set in determination. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he was going to find this man. He was going to end it, one way or another. He turned and walked out of the diner, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. The sound of his steps echoed in the silence of the night. He didn't look back. He knew what he had to do, and he wasn't going to stop until Emily was safe. I don't know how long it took, but Jake's mind was racing as he rode toward the warehouse on the outskirts of town. The woman in the diner had given him just enough to go on, but the warehouse was a dead end, and the fact that no one had seen anything, or at least no one was talking, made Jake's instincts flare. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just any ordinary criminal. He was smart, calculating. He had people in place, making sure no one knew what was really happening. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars as the sound of his Harley echoed through the empty roads. The wind whipped against his face, biting through his leather jacket, but Jake barely noticed it. His mind was focused on one thing: finding this man and ending it. He had made a promise to Emily, and he wasn't about to break it. The bike roared to life as he approached the edge of town. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. It was tucked away in the back of an industrial park, surrounded by empty buildings that looked like they hadn't seen any action in years. The only light came from a flickering street lamp in the distance, casting long shadows over the pavement. Jake pulled the bike up to the curb, cutting the engine and allowing the night's silence to settle in. He stayed on the bike for a moment, his eyes scanning the area, trying to catch any sign of movement. There was nothing. No sound, no indication that anyone was nearby. But Jake knew better than to think this place was truly empty. He could feel it in his gut. This was the place. This is where everything would come to a head. He dismounted the bike, leaving it where it was. He didn't want to risk it being heard if he needed to make a quick escape. Slowly, he moved toward the entrance of the warehouse, his footsteps light but purposeful. His hand hovered near the handle of the gun tucked into the waistband of his jeans. He wasn't planning on using it unless he had to, but with everything on the line, he wasn't going to leave it to chance. As he approached the entrance, he noticed the large metal doors were partially ajar, just enough to give someone the chance to slip inside unnoticed. Jake pressed his back to the wall, taking a deep breath as he carefully peered around the edge of the door. He could make out vague shapes inside, shadows moving in and out of view, too quick to get a good look at. His pulse quickened. Whoever was inside wasn't alone. There were at least two, maybe more. His fingers tightened around the grip of his gun, ready for whatever came next. He needed to know who they were, what they were doing, and most importantly, where the man who had been hunting Emily was. He waited for a few moments, listening. The sounds inside were faint, but he could make out muffled voices. One of them sounded like a man, low and gruff, the kind of voice you didn't want to hear when things were about to get real. Jake's instincts told him to move fast. He couldn't waste time waiting around for the perfect moment. Stepping quickly, he pushed the door open just enough to slip through. The inside of the warehouse was cold and smelled of rust and oil, the faint echo of movement in the distance. Jake crept forward, keeping to the shadows as best as he could. He spotted a few crates scattered around the room, some of them overturned, others stacked neatly in rows. His eyes darted around, trying to find the source of the voices. He moved quietly, staying low, his heart pounding in his chest. As he turned a corner, he spotted them. Two men were huddled near the back of the warehouse, talking in low, urgent voices. They didn't notice Jake at first. He took a deep breath, slowly moving closer. "You heard about the girl, right?" one of them said. Jake's heart skipped a beat. They were talking about Emily. "Yeah, I heard," the other man replied. "But we gotta move fast. If he finds out we're behind this, we're done for. You don't mess with people like him." Jake's muscles tensed. He was getting closer to the truth, closer to the answers he needed. But he couldn't let them know he was there. Not yet. He had to stay in control. "We're not going to get away with this," the first man said. "Not unless we deal with her, too. That girl is a liability." Jake felt his blood run cold. These men were talking about Emily as if she were just a problem to be solved. He couldn't let that happen. Not on his watch. He moved closer, ready to confront them, but something stopped him. A door creaked open behind him, and before he could react, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. He spun around, ready to fight, but when he saw who it was, his heart stopped. There, standing in the doorway, was the man he had been looking for. The one who had been hunting Emily. The one who had caused her so much pain. His eyes locked with Jake's, cold and calculating. Jake's hand went for his gun, but before he could draw, the man spoke. "I knew you'd come here," he said, his voice low and smooth. "You're too predictable." Jake's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. I don't know how long Jake stood there, staring at the man who had been hunting Emily, but it felt like time had stopped. His body was frozen, every muscle tensed, ready to fight. The man in front of him was tall, his dark eyes cold and calculating. He was dressed in a dark jacket, and his presence alone sent a chill down Jake's spine. Jake knew he was face to face with someone dangerous, someone who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. "I knew you'd come here," the man repeated, his voice smooth and mocking. "You're too predictable." Jake's grip tightened around his gun, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He wasn't sure what the man was capable of, but he could feel that this encounter would not end easily. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice low, the words carrying a weight of danger. The man's lips curled into a cold smile, and for a moment, he didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Jake's. "You really don't know, do you?" the man said, his tone dripping with amusement. "I'm the one who's been pulling the strings, who's been making sure your little friend here stays scared. I'm the one who's been hunting her." Jake's stomach twisted. This was worse than he thought. This man wasn't just some random thug. He was the mastermind behind everything that had been happening to Emily. Jake's mind raced. He had to keep his cool. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a fight for Emily's life. "What do you want with her?" Jake demanded, stepping closer. "Why are you doing this?" The man shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "She's a liability," he said, his voice low. "Her mother got in the way of things. She knew too much, and now Emily's the last piece of the puzzle." Jake's heart hammered in his chest. This wasn't just about fear. This man was using Emily for something bigger, something more sinister. Jake clenched his fists. "You'll never get away with this," he growled. The man's smile widened. "You really think that?" he asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "I've always gotten away with everything, and I'm not about to stop now." Without warning, the man lunged forward, a knife gleaming in his hand. Jake was faster. He grabbed the man's wrist mid-lunge, twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the floor, and they both stumbled, fighting for control. Jake's heart raced, but he kept his focus. He couldn't let this man get the upper hand. They struggled in the dim light, the sound of boots pounding against the floor echoing through the warehouse. Jake could feel his muscles burning as he fought to keep the man down. But the man was strong, his every move calculated. "You think you can stop me?" The man spat, his voice filled with rage. "You're nothing. You're just a roadblock. And I've been taking care of roadblocks my whole life." Jake didn't say anything. His only focus was the man in front of him. He couldn't let him hurt Emily. He couldn't let him keep terrorizing her. With a sudden burst of strength, Jake slammed the man into a stack of crates. The man groaned, but Jake didn't give him a chance to recover. He moved quickly, pinning him to the ground, his knee pressing into the man's chest. The man gasped for air, but Jake held him there, the weight of his body keeping him down. "You're done," Jake said, his voice low and fierce. "This ends tonight." The man's eyes narrowed, a sneer spreading across his face. "You think this is over?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You have no idea what's really going on. This is bigger than you. Bigger than anything you can imagine." Jake didn't respond. He just tightened his grip, not letting the man move. He could feel the man's strength starting to wane, his resistance fading. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man stopped struggling. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Jake stood up, releasing his hold on the man. "You're not in charge anymore," Jake said, his voice cold. "This ends now. You won't hurt her again." The man laughed bitterly, but there was no humor in it. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "You have no idea what you're up against. This isn't just about one little girl. This is about something much bigger. And when I get out, you'll wish you'd never crossed me." Jake didn't flinch. He had heard threats like this before, but they didn't scare him anymore. He was done being afraid. Done letting people like this man control the narrative. "We'll see about that," Jake said, his eyes hard as steel. He knew that this wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a step in the right direction. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt Emily again. Not on his watch. He turned to leave the warehouse, the man's laughter echoing in his ears. But it didn't matter. Jake had won, and he wasn't going to stop until Emily was safe. He walked out into the night, his mind set on one thing, bringing this all to an end. Emily was depending on him, and he wouldn't fail her. I don't know how long Jake had been standing there, but the cold breeze was starting to feel like an assault on his senses. He had left the man tied up in the warehouse, but something in his gut told him that this wasn't over. There was still something lurking out there, something he hadn't yet uncovered. He had made the mistake of thinking he had it all under control before, but now he knew better. The man he had just confronted had spoken of something bigger. It was bigger than him, bigger than Emily, and Jake needed to find out what it was. He got back on his bike, the engine roaring to life as he sped down the empty streets, his mind racing with questions. What did the man mean when he said this was bigger than Emily? Was it possible that this whole situation was just a small part of something much larger? Jake knew one thing for sure. He couldn't go back to the cabin. Not yet. He needed answers. He needed to figure out who else was involved. The last thing he wanted was to walk blindly into a trap. The thought of Emily sitting back at the cabin, unaware of what was really happening, made his stomach churn. He couldn't let anything happen to her. Not after everything she had been through. The ride through the night was almost meditative. The wind rushing past him, the low hum of the engine beneath him, it all calmed him down. But it wasn't enough to shake the gnawing feeling in his chest. He needed information. He needed to find the people who were behind all of this, the people who had been tormenting Emily and her family. He wasn't sure where to start, but he knew that he had to go back to the people who had known him the longest, the ones he could trust, the Hells Angels chapter he had once been a part of. It wasn't exactly the safest place to go, but Jake needed answers, and they had the connections. He just hoped they hadn't been compromised. As he pulled up to the old, familiar building, the sense of nostalgia hit him like a wave. It had been years since he had set foot here. The old clubhouse still looked the same, the lights dimming in the windows like they were waiting for someone to walk through the door. Jake hesitated for a moment before dismounting the bike. He wasn't sure what kind of reception he would get, but he couldn't afford to back down now. He needed help. The door creaked open as Jake entered, the familiar smell of stale beer and tobacco filling the air. There was no one at the bar, but he could hear the murmurs of voices coming from the back. It wasn't a warm welcome, but it wasn't hostile either. Not yet. As he made his way deeper into the clubhouse, he spotted a few familiar faces. Some were still here, just like him, having left their old lives behind. Others he didn't recognize. It had been too long. "Jake!" A voice called from behind him. He turned to see a man in a leather vest, his face weathered by time, but still holding the same intensity Jake remembered. It was Mike, an old member from his chapter. They had fought side by side back in the day, and Jake knew he could trust him. "You're a long way from home," Mike said, eyeing Jake carefully. "What's going on?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I need your help. It's about a girl. A kid. She's in danger, and I need to find out who's behind it all." Mike's expression shifted, the casual demeanor fading into something more serious. "You know the code, Jake. We don't get involved in civilian stuff." Jake nodded. He knew what Mike was thinking. It wasn't the first time a situation had gotten out of hand. But this was different. "This isn't just some random trouble," Jake said, his voice low. "This is personal. I need to know who's pulling the strings." Mike took a moment, glancing around the room before speaking again. "All right, I'll see what I can do. But if this goes sideways, you're on your own. Understand?" Jake didn't hesitate. "I don't need anyone to cover for me. I just need information." Mike gave him a sharp look before nodding. "I'll make some calls. Stay here. We'll figure it out." Jake nodded, his thoughts already racing. He wasn't sure how long it would take, but he knew this was the best shot he had. As Mike stepped out to make the calls, Jake sat at the bar, trying to calm his nerves. The silence in the room felt deafening, each minute dragging on as if the whole world was holding its breath. He wasn't used to waiting. He wasn't used to feeling helpless. But this time, he had no choice. Emily's life was on the line, and Jake wasn't going to let her down. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it, no matter what. A few minutes later, Mike returned, his face serious. "I've got something," he said, his voice low. "The guy you're after? He's connected. Not just some small-time thug. He's tied to a bigger operation. I don't know all the details, but we're talking about people who've got a lot more power than we do." Jake's stomach dropped. This was bigger than he thought. Whoever was after Emily wasn't just a predator. They were part of something much larger. But now Jake had a name, a lead to follow. And that was all he needed. "Where do I find him?" Jake asked, his voice steady. Mike hesitated, then passed Jake a piece of paper with an address written on it. "Be careful, Jake. This isn't a game." Jake stood up, his resolve hardening. "I'm not playing games anymore." He pocketed the paper and walked out of the clubhouse, the weight of what lay ahead settling heavily on his shoulders. But there was no turning back now. Emily was waiting for him, and Jake was going to find the answers he needed, no matter the cost. I don't know how long it took Jake to get to the address Mike had given him, but the ride felt longer than it should have. His mind was racing with everything he had learned so far. The man who had been hunting Emily was no ordinary criminal. He was part of something much larger, a network with more power and influence than Jake had anticipated. But now he had a name, a lead to follow, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. He couldn't. Emily was counting on him. The place Mike had sent him to was located on the edge of town, away from the more populated areas. It was a rundown industrial park, surrounded by empty buildings that looked like they hadn't been used in years. The air felt thick with tension, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He parked his bike behind a dilapidated building, cutting the engine. The sounds of the night filled the air, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic, and the occasional creak of old metal. Jake didn't move immediately. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. This wasn't going to be easy, but it never was. He checked his gun, making sure it was secure, and then made his way toward the building marked with an address. The building itself was tall, dark, and looming, with a sense of abandonment that made it feel like a graveyard for broken dreams. Jake crept along the side of the building, keeping to the shadows as best as he could. His senses were heightened, every sound amplifying in the stillness of the night. He reached the back door, which was slightly ajar. There were no guards, no warning signs. Just an open door, like an invitation. Jake pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking as it moved. He stepped inside, immediately hit with the smell of mildew and rust. The inside was a labyrinth of abandoned equipment, broken machinery, and piles of discarded junk. Jake moved carefully, his steps measured as he navigated through the maze of debris. There were no lights, just the faint glow from a few broken windows, casting shadows that danced on the walls. His eyes scanned every corner, every crevice, looking for any sign of movement. He knew the man he was after could be anywhere, hidden in the shadows just like him. The deeper Jake went, the more he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about stopping one man. It was about shutting down an entire operation, about taking down a network that had been preying on people for far too long. He could feel it in his bones. It was bigger than he thought. He rounded a corner and stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the middle of the room, was a man sitting at a desk, his back to Jake. The man didn't notice him at first. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This was the man he had been looking for, the one who had been hunting Emily, the man who had been behind everything. He was sitting there, calm and composed, as if he didn't have a care in the world. Jake's hand went to the gun at his side, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He needed answers. "So, you finally found me," the man said, his voice smooth and calm, almost mocking. "I knew it was only a matter of time before you showed up." Jake stayed silent, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The confrontation he had been waiting for. The man turned slowly in his chair, his eyes locking with Jake's. He was tall, with sharp features and a cold expression. His eyes were dark, calculating, like he had seen it all, and nothing surprised him anymore. "You think you're going to stop me?" the man asked, his lips curling into a smile. "You're just one man. You can't take down an operation like mine. Not alone." Jake's jaw clenched. "I'm not here for your operation. I'm here for her." The man's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He stood up slowly, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Ah, the girl. The pawn in your little game," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "You really think you're the hero here? That you can save her for me?" Jake's grip tightened on his gun. "I'm not playing games. You've hurt her. You've hurt people. And I'm putting an end to it." The man laughed, a low, hollow sound. "You're too late," he said, his voice cold. "You have no idea what you're up against. There are bigger forces at play here, things you can't even begin to understand." Jake's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about Emily. This was part of something far larger, something Jake had no way of fully comprehending. But one thing was clear. He couldn't back down now. "I don't care what you're part of," Jake said, his voice low. "I'm not letting you hurt anyone else." The man's smile returned, but there was no humor in it. "You really think you can stop me? You're already too deep in. And when I'm done with you, you won't even know who to trust." Jake's heart raced, but he didn't show it. He was done with threats. It was time to finish this. He lunged forward, his hand pulling the gun free, but before he could react, the man was gone. The room was empty, the chairs spinning slowly. Jake's mind raced. He had been so focused on the man in front of him that he didn't see the trap coming. The man had vanished. He was gone, but he wasn't done yet. Jake cursed under his breath. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I don't know how long it took Jake to realize the man had vanished, but the emptiness in the room felt suffocating. His breath was heavy, his fists clenched, but the man he had been chasing was gone, slipping through his fingers once again. The chair spun slowly, as if mocking him. The man's last words echoed in Jake's mind. There were bigger forces at play here. Jake had thought he was just fighting one man, but now it was clear. This was much more than that. Jake's eyes scanned the room, looking for any clue, any sign of where the man had gone. He had been so focused on the confrontation that he hadn't noticed the subtle things. The door slightly ajar, the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. His eyes narrowed. He wasn't about to let the man get away. Not this time. He moved quickly, his heart pounding in his chest as he left the empty room. The building was eerily silent, the shadows stretching out in every direction. He had to find the man, and fast. But he couldn't do it alone. The realization hit him hard. He had to get back to Emily. She was in danger, and he had no idea what kind of game this man was playing. Jake's footsteps echoed through the hallways as he made his way back to the entrance. His mind raced with possibilities, but all of them led to one thing. He couldn't keep running after this man without knowing what he was up against. He needed more information. He needed a plan. Jake reached his bike, firing up the engine without hesitation. He knew where he had to go. The Hells Angels clubhouse. He had hoped he wouldn't have to go back there, but Mike had given him a lead. He wasn't sure how much it would help, but it was his best shot. The ride back was quick, his focus sharp. As he approached the clubhouse, he saw the familiar sign in the distance, but there was something different in the air tonight. The streets seemed quieter, the world outside the clubhouse eerily still. He parked the bike, his mind already thinking of what he needed to do. He couldn't afford to waste time. He walked into the clubhouse, the familiar smell of cigarettes and stale beer hitting him immediately. He didn't see anyone right away, but he knew they were around. "Mike," Jake called out, his voice echoing in the quiet room. It didn't take long for Mike to appear from the back, his face serious as he took in Jake's appearance. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Mike said, his tone heavy with concern. "What happened?" Jake didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need everything you've got on the man who's been hunting Emily. There's more going on here than I thought. He's not just one guy. There's a whole operation behind him." Mike's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jake saw the old glint of respect in his eyes. "You're in deeper than you think," Mike said, his voice low. "All right, I'll get you the information, but this isn't something you want to go digging into. The people behind this, they're not the kind you mess with." Jake didn't flinch. "I'm not backing down. Emily's life is on the line." Mike studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but you've been warned." Jake took a seat at the bar as Mike made a few calls, his mind still spinning from the encounter at the warehouse. He couldn't stop thinking about what the man had said. He was too predictable, and if that was true, then Jake had been walking into a trap from the start. But what was the trap? What was the bigger picture? Mike returned after a few minutes, his expression grim. "I got some intel. The man you're after, he's connected to a larger operation. It's not just human trafficking like you thought. There's something bigger, something more dangerous." Jake's stomach tightened. This was worse than he thought. "What kind of operation?" he asked, his voice low. Mike leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not going to like this, but this man is part of a network that's been working with some of the most dangerous people in the country. Arms dealing, drug trafficking, you name it. And they're not going to stop. They've got connections in places you wouldn't believe." Jake's heart raced. "What do we do now?" Mike sighed, rubbing his temples. "You've already gone too far, Jake. But if you're determined to keep going, you need to be careful. These people, they don't play by the rules. If you want to bring them down, you're going to need more than just a few leads. You need backup, and you need to plan this carefully." Jake stood up, his mind set. "I'm not going to wait around for them to make their next move. I'll handle it." Mike didn't argue, but the look in his eyes said it all. He knew Jake was headed for a collision with something far bigger than he had imagined. As Jake walked out of the clubhouse, he knew he was getting closer to the heart of the operation. The man he had confronted at the warehouse, the one who had been hunting Emily, was just the tip of the iceberg. The real danger was still out there, and Jake was going to find it. He didn't know how, and he didn't know when, but he wouldn't stop until this was over. Emily was depending on him, and Jake was going to finish this once and for all. I don't know how long it had been since Jake walked out of the clubhouse, but the weight of everything that had been said, everything he had learned, pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. The intel Mike had given him was clear. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about something much larger, a network so deep and vast that Jake felt like a single man, standing in the shadows, trying to take on the impossible. But he couldn't back down. Emily needed him, and he wasn't going to fail her. The streets were empty as Jake made his way to the bike, the night air cold against his skin. The only sound was the faint hum of the motorcycle as he started it up, the low growl of the engine filling the silence. His mind was consumed by one thought. He had to stop this. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about an entire operation that was feeding off the fear of people like Emily. And Jake wasn't going to let that happen. As the engine roared to life, Jake's thoughts were a blur. The warehouse, the man, the network, everything was tangled together in a knot that he couldn't untangle, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to keep moving forward. Emily's safety was everything. He had to find the people behind this, the ones who had been pulling the strings. The more Jake thought about the operation Mike had mentioned, the more it felt like he was staring into the abyss. Arms dealing, human trafficking, drugs. These were people who didn't care about anyone, not about Emily, not about the lives they ruined. They were playing a game, and the stakes were far higher than Jake had anticipated. As Jake rode through the darkened streets, he knew he had to get to the source. The man who had been hunting Emily, the one who had orchestrated everything. He had to be taken down, but that wasn't going to be easy. Mike had warned him, and Jake could feel the truth of it in every bone in his body. He needed more than just his fists and his gun to take on something this big. He needed a plan. He needed backup. But there was no time to waste. He wasn't going to sit back and wait for the right moment. The right moment was now. Jake's mind raced as he headed for the outskirts of the city. There, in the shadows, was where this whole thing had started. The man who had been hunting Emily, the network he had been part of, all of it. Jake wasn't about to let this drag on any longer. The bike cut through the night, and the familiar landscape began to blur around him. As he reached the outskirts of the city, the buildings thinned out, replaced by open fields and darkened streets. The place felt desolate, empty, just the kind of place Jake needed to get answers. He pulled up in front of an old warehouse, the same one Mike had mentioned earlier. The place looked like it hadn't seen a life in years, but Jake knew better. This was where it all happened. This was where the man, the one who had started it all, had been hiding. He killed the engine and parked the bike, his boots hitting the cold pavement with a heavy thud. His hand instinctively reached for the gun at his side, but he knew better. He had to be smart. He had to play this carefully. He approached the warehouse, his steps slow and deliberate. The windows were boarded up, and the door was locked, but Jake knew that wasn't going to stop him. He wasn't afraid of breaking in. He was afraid of what he would find inside. The door creaked open as he pushed it, his eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. But there was something else, a faint, musty odor, like something had been hidden away for far too long. Jake's hand tightened around the handle of his gun, his eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. He wasn't alone. The silence was deafening. He moved through the warehouse cautiously, every footstep echoing in the stillness. The building was eerily quiet, but Jake's instincts told him something wasn't right. He kept his back against the wall as he moved deeper into the building, every nerve in his body alert. The farther he went, the more he could feel it. This place was alive with secrets, and Jake was about to uncover them all. He reached a door at the back of the warehouse, and his breath caught in his throat. It was slightly ajar. Jake moved forward, his gun raised. But before he could enter, he heard a voice. "You're too late," it said. Jake froze. The voice was calm, cold, familiar. It was the man he had been chasing. He stepped into the room, his eyes locking onto the figure standing in the shadows. The man smiled. "I knew you'd come. You think you can stop this? You have no idea what you're up against." Jake's heart raced as he stepped forward, every instinct telling him this was it, the final confrontation. But even as he faced the man, Jake knew this wasn't going to be easy. The fight was only just beginning. The man's smile widened, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "You'll regret this, Jake. You've just stepped into something much bigger than you can handle." Jake's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the gun. "I don't care how big it is," he said, his voice steady. "You're not getting away with this." The man's smile faltered for a moment, then returned, colder than ever. "We'll see about that." I don't know what Jake expected to feel when he finally came face to face with the man who had been hunting Emily, but it wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was something darker, something that made his blood run colder than the night air. The man's smile, that cold, calculating grin, seemed to mock him, and Jake could feel the tension building inside him. He had been chasing this ghost for too long, and now, standing here, he could see that this was more than just one man. This was an entire operation, a network that had been controlling people, manipulating them, for far too long. And Jake wasn't going to let it continue. The man took a step forward, his presence overwhelming. "You really think you can stop this, Jake?" he asked, his voice smooth and confident. "You're out of your depth. There's nothing you can do now. You're just a small player in a much bigger game." Jake clenched his jaw, keeping his eyes locked with the man's. "I don't need to understand the whole game," Jake said, his voice low but steady. "All I need to know is how to stop you." The man's smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough to make Jake's pulse quicken. He was getting to him. This wasn't just about a battle of strength anymore. It was a battle of willpower. The man stepped closer, his movements calculated, almost predatory. "You think you're the hero here?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. "You're just a distraction. Hey, little thorn in the side of a much bigger operation." Jake didn't flinch. "You've hurt too many people," he said, his voice firm. "This ends now." The man laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "You have no idea what you're up against. This isn't just about power, Jake. It's about control. It's about a system that runs far deeper than you could ever imagine. You're not just fighting me. You're fighting a machine." Jake's eyes narrowed. This was bigger than he thought. But that didn't change anything. He was here now, and he wasn't backing down. He took a step forward, his hands resting on the gun at his side. "I'm not afraid of your machine," Jake said. "I've been in the darkness long enough to know how to fight back." The man's eyes flickered, a spark of something, fear maybe, passing across his face. But it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "You're a fool," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can take me down? You're just one man who's already too deep. There's no way out for you." Jake's grip tightened on his gun, but he didn't draw it yet. He wasn't going to make the first move, not until he was sure he had the upper hand. "You're right about one thing," Jake said, his voice steady, unwavering. "This doesn't end with you." The man's smile returned, but it was colder now. "You really think you can take me down and walk away? That's cute. But you're wrong. You're too far in. You'll never escape this." Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. His eyes were locked on the man, calculating his next move. He had come too far to back down now. The man stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Go ahead," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do your worst. But remember this, Jake. Even if you kill me, you'll never stop what's coming." That was the moment Jake realized how much bigger this was. It wasn't just about stopping one man. This was about taking down a whole network. A system built on control, fear, and manipulation. And Jake wasn't about to let it continue. He stepped forward, his heart pounding, and before the man could say another word, Jake drew his gun. The man's eyes widened, but he didn't move fast enough. The shot rang out in the stillness of the warehouse, echoing off the walls. But it wasn't the end. It wasn't over, because Jake knew that the man wasn't the only one involved in this. He was just a piece of the puzzle, and the rest of the pieces were still out there. He knew he couldn't stop here. He had to find the rest of them, take down the whole operation. And that meant he had to keep moving forward. He couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. With the man lying on the floor, blood pooling around him, Jake turned and walked out of the warehouse. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He had done what needed to be done. But the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I don't know how long Jake walked through the night, but as the cold air bit into his skin, he felt the weight of what he had done. The man who had hunted Emily was gone, but Jake knew this wasn't the end. He had killed the figurehead, but the network still thrived. There were more players out there, pulling strings in the shadows, and they wouldn't stop unless Jake stopped them. His mind raced as he made his way back to the cabin, his pulse still high from the confrontation. He knew Emily was waiting for him, but there was no time to rest. The more he thought about the operation Mike had hinted at, the more he realized how deep it ran. This wasn't just about one person or even one group. This was an entire system built on fear, control, and manipulation. And that system had to be destroyed. He entered the cabin quietly, the door creaking softly as he pushed it open. Emily was sitting at the table, her eyes wide as she looked up at him. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Jake could see the mix of fear and trust in her gaze. She was scared, but she had come to depend on him. That was enough for him to keep going. "You're back," she whispered, her voice small, but the relief in it was evident. Jake gave a small nod, his face hard, determined. "It's not over, Emily," he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. "There's a bigger fight ahead. We need to finish this." Emily didn't speak at first, her gaze dropping to the table, her fingers twisting nervously. "What's going to happen now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Jake exhaled slowly. "Now we take them all down. We find the rest of the people behind this, and we make sure they don't hurt anyone else." Emily looked up, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "How do we do that?" she asked. Jake paused. "I can't do this alone," he admitted, his voice softer than before. "I'll need help, but we'll make sure it's over. For good." The weight of his words hung in the air. He could feel the enormity of what they were about to face, but there was no turning back now. He couldn't let Emily live in fear anymore. He wouldn't let anyone hurt her again. Over the next few days, Jake worked tirelessly, reaching out to those he could trust. Mike helped connect him with other former members of the Hells Angels, some who still had connections to the underground world that Jake was now ready to confront. The more they dug, the more they uncovered. The network ran deep, with ties to not just local criminals, but international operations. Arms dealing, human trafficking, drug smuggling. It was all connected, and every single person involved had to be brought down. Jake wasn't going to let the people who had tormented Emily, and so many others get away with it. With every step, the picture became clearer. They had to strike quickly. The operation was vast, and time was running out. But Jake had a plan. He had already seen the damage they could do, and now he was prepared to bring it all crashing down. The night before the final takedown, Jake sat with Emily. They didn't speak much, but there was a quiet understanding between them. They both knew what was coming. The next day, Jake and the small group of trusted allies launched their plan. They hit the operations headquarters in a series of well-coordinated raids. Every corner was covered, every potential escape route sealed. They worked like clockwork, taking down each layer of the operation with precision. By the end of the day, they had arrested the people at the top, the ones who had been orchestrating everything. They couldn't have done it without each other. Jake's team had proven invaluable, and Emily, despite her fear, had remained strong. The weight of it all finally started to settle on Jake. They had won, but the victory didn't feel as sweet as he expected. The network had been broken, but the scars would remain. As the sun began to rise on a new day, Jake knew this was just the beginning. He would never forget what he had done and the people he had fought for. Emily was safe, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he had done something that mattered. He had kept his promise. The nightmare was over. But Jake knew there would always be something darker waiting in the shadows, something else to fight for. And he would be ready, because he had learned that the fight never truly ended. But as long as people like Emily needed him, Jake would be there to stand against it. In this gripping tale of survival, Jake, a former Hells Angels member, finds himself caught in a battle far bigger than he imagined. When a young girl named Emily becomes the target of a ruthless network of criminals, Jake is thrust back into a world of danger he thought he left behind. The story follows Jake's journey to protect Emily, uncovering dark secrets and making dangerous enemies along the way. As Jake gets closer to the truth, he learns that the man hunting Emily is just the tip of the iceberg, and the operation stretches far deeper than he ever anticipated. With the odds stacked against him, Jake must rely on his old skills and the help of trusted allies to take down the network and bring those responsible to justice. The Hells Angels stories serve as the backdrop to this intense and emotional journey, blending action, suspense, and heart-stopping twists. As Jake fights to protect Emily and uncover the full scope of the criminal operation, the tension mounts, and every decision becomes a matter of life or death. From abandoned warehouses to underground connections, this Hells Angels story takes you on a roller coaster ride of danger, betrayal, and redemption. Will Jake be able to stop the ruthless criminals and protect the girl who has come to depend on him? Or will the darkness of his past be too much to overcome? This thrilling story offers an unflinching look into the world of crime, loyalty, and the fight for survival, making it a must-read for fans of Hells Angels stories and gripping crime thrillers. As the story unfolds, the truth about the network begins to emerge, and Jake's journey becomes even more personal. With every move, the stakes grow higher, and the line between friend and foe becomes increasingly blurred. Hells Angels stories have always captured the raw intensity of living on the edge, and this one is no exception. The twists and turns keep you guessing until the very end, with a conclusion that leaves you breathless. As Jake's fight against the odds intensifies, it becomes clear that the battle for Emily's safety is far from over, and the legacy of the Hells Angels stories lives on in every step of his journey.